If you have a complex timeline where RAM might not be enough to give you smooth playback, you can also cache to disk. We can use the GPU to create a hard disk cache that will be applied to the timeline. We can access the options from the cache menu, and then disk cache. You can also access it by right-clicking on the timeline, also from the Project tab, and lastly, the dedicated cache icon in the timeline. You can cache the sequence range. We can be more selective and cache the selected shot ranges. And you can cache by the in and out points. The cache will create the result of all the tracks that make up the image in the viewer, and then write out an EXR sequence to disk using the GPU. This is important to understand. Let's create a cache for this section. These tracks that are enabled are combining to create a disk cache. When we cache, we see the orange line representing the disk cache. We now have a cache for this portion of our timeline. If we introduce a new element to this section, we will no longer have the disk cache for this area. This is because this is not what is expected in the viewer when the cache was created. If we wanted to have a disk cache for this scenario as well, then we can cache again with the new element enabled. We now have a created disk cache for both scenarios. If we disable this track, Hiero will find the cache for this scenario in the viewer and then apply that cache from the disk. This could be helpful for reviews in which we know we'll be viewing different setups. Although you can cache the entire sequence, it can be effective to cache the heavier areas of your timeline, and then you have a mix of both disk cache and RAM cache. We can clear the disk cache from the sequence, shot ranges, or in and out points. You can jump right to your cache settings from all the disk cache menus. Under the timeline disk caching header, you can set up some options. You want to point to a high-speed disk that you can write cache to. You can limit the amount of space you want to use for writing the cache. Note the slider will go to 100, but you can manually change the number if you want something above that. We can change what EXR compression type is used when written to disk. And we can clear all. Clearing all from our preferences acts differently from the other menus. This will clear the timeline disk cache for all the projects you're using. You would use this option to free up space on all the completed projects.